So I'm reading a memo that's over 50 years old and is currently dismantling our democracy. You can draw a straight line from it to our emerging tech oligarchy.
Oh, I don't think we're witnessing the start of an oligarchy. I think we are fully here.
And here's the scary thing. Even if we manage to stop Doge or the terrorizing of migrants, this memo and its half-century of influence, well, it isn't going anywhere. And if anyone is going to have any hope of saving our democracy, politicians and activists need to combat its legacy.
Welcome to the new American oligarchy.
So it's 1971 and corporate lawyer Lewis Powell is cracking open my favorite toilet read, Fortune magazine, when he sees his worst enemy staring back at him.
You know his name. It's Ralph Nader. He's father of this country's consumer movement. In almost 30 years of advocacy, he has created a national consciousness about product safety in almost all areas of our lives, from the cars we drive to where we work.
As a board member of Philip Morris, Powell's mission was convincing the public that cigarettes weren't really that bad for you. The celebrity of this car safety crusader was horrifying to Powell, so he called up his neighbor to complain about Nader's threat to the great American tradition of corporate crime. And maybe just to shut him up, that neighbor, who happened to run the Chamber of Commerce, commissioned Powell to write a confidential memorandum for its members. It would become a 6,400-word screed about the plight of the forgotten man. The forgotten man here is corporate America, which in Powell's view had as little influence in government of any group in the country. Titled Attack on American Free Enterprise System, his memo began, "No thoughtful person can question that the American economic system is under broad attack." Those attacks were coming from leftist radicals who he once compared to Adolf Hitler. Maybe now he'd compare them to Kanye West. Powell reflected that America's devoted businessmen hadn't been prepared for the left's guerrilla warfare, as they'd been too busy doing their jobs and generally being good citizens. He writes, "The time has come for the wisdom, ingenuity, and resources of American businesses to be marshaled against those who would destroy it." In short, he wanted a government run for business, by business. What we in the industry like to call an oligarchy. Powell boldly called for corporate America to seize power and use it aggressively, without embarrassment and without the reluctance which has been so characteristic of American business. And the American business world was ready to listen. Powell's memo circulated widely, essentially going pre-internet viral, according to the investigative journalist behind the podcast The Master Plan. Powell gained immediate disciples. Joseph Coors of Really Cold Beer fame read the memo and launched the massively influential Heritage Foundation, whose pro-business policy recommendations would culminate with Project 2025.
With its stated goal being, quote, to assemble an army of aligned, vetted, trained, and prepared conservatives to go to work on day one to deconstruct the administrative state.
Everyone from the Koch brothers to billionaire activist Richard Mellon Scaife took his words to heart. The Chamber of Commerce quickly organized 2 Powell Memo task force conventions in 1973, the Levitt reports. One at the Polynesian Resort in Disney, one in Texas, and participants ranged from soon-to-be President Gerald Ford to the young, ambitious Roger Ailes. Now, Powell's main concern was reestablishing corporate interest in 4 arenas: politics and public opinion, the media, and college campuses. I want to talk about each of them and how they've created our modern nightmare, but let's start with college campuses. Now, in Powell's telling, the most dangerous enemy of the business elite, besides Nader, was personally attractive and magnetic leftist thinkers on college campuses who were leading millions of bright young men to hate their country and its freedoms. I feel really seen right now. You know, I don't know if I was a personally attractive professor. Actually, on Rate My Professor, they'd have the chili pepper, and I often got the chili pepper, so thanks, students. But as one might expect from a partner at a law firm that wouldn't hire black people, a certain kind of revolutionary especially got Powell's goat. He specifies that in most of these groups, the movement against the system is participated in only by minorities. Yet, these often are the most articulate, the most vocal, the most prolific in their writing and speaking. I'm not gonna say he's like less than a racist, but at least he's a complimentary racist, I guess. As part of its quest to regain power, Powell argued that corporate America should propagate pro-business sentiments in academia by, among other things, sending equally attractive, articulate, and well-informed speakers. Groups like the National Association of Scholars began to crop up, boldly promoting Western intellectual heritage, combating multicultural or feminist curricula, and funding the careers of aspiring conservative scholars. Financial speculators funded economics professors to downplay market risks before the 2008 financial collapse. By 2011, the Charles G. Koch Foundation went mask off and took over hiring at Florida State University via its $1.5 million grant. Today, the tech oligarchy has its hands all over academia. academia. They pay for the research of the very people in a position to criticize them, says scholar Hani Farid. It's what the oil and gas industry has done with climate change, and it's what the tobacco companies did with cigarette research. Powell's memo also warned that school textbooks should be put under instant surveillance because they were being covertly rewritten by civil rights and union activists, rather than showing both sides of highly debatable topics like segregation. At the same time, Powell's call for corporate America to create its own culture of scholarship and activism was met practically overnight with a flood of right-wing think tanks like the Cato Institute and the Federalist Society. While designing their PR makeover, the corporate class heeded Powell's warning that no one business could campaign too prominently, lest it become a target of the left's wrath. Rather, they collectively pooled their resources behind faceless, pleasantly titled organizations like the Chamber of Commerce or the Free Enterprise Institute, which is exactly what they did to fend off Powell's nemesis, Ralph Nader. Fun fact, the first time I voted in a presidential election, I voted for Ralph Nader. Hit me in the comments and say, you ruined it. You voted for a third-party candidate, and that's why Bush was president. I was voting in California. It didn't matter, and I did it to impress a girl. Mere months after the memo gained popularity, lobbying group Business Roundtable formed, quickly enlisting 113 Fortune 200 CEOs. They bankrolled what one congressman called the most intense lobbying I have ever seen to defeat Ralph Nader's 1977 plan to start a non-regulatory consumer protection agency to advocate for things like fair prices and better safety measures. In case you're not tuned into the news, Elon Musk and Doge is currently gutting the Consumer Protections Bureau. That's cool. And we saw this the day before we were filming this video when Musk had a really bizarre press conference in the Oval Office. There's an article about it here titled, "Musk's Cheeky Son Steals Show as He Picks Nose and Squirms in Oval Office with Don." And now if you just read that headline, you might just skip over it, right? Because if the most headline-inspiring thing that happened was Elon's kid picking boogers, well, there's probably not anything, newsworthy going on. But if you look at a headline from a different source covering the same story, you can read something like, "Musk's Shadow Presidency Unmasked in Oval Office Stunt," which would make you feel very different and focus on how weird things are getting. So how is it possible that the same story can be covered completely differently depending on which news source you're looking at? Well, many media organizations prioritize clicks over clear and accurate information, right? They focus on sensational stories and controversies instead of careful discussions. Now, those articles, well, I found them on Ground News, which is where I read all my news every day. Now, they're the sponsor of today's video, and their app and website pulls stories from across the globe into one place, which gives you a full picture on every story. Now, this story has been reported by over 100 sources, and we can see here where each one leans politically with their bias distribution chart. You can also check the factuality rating, which scores the reliability of reporting, and it even lets you see who owns the source. Now, these factors shape how stories are framed, letting you compare how bias impacts coverage, like we saw in the articles mentioned earlier. My favorite feature on Ground News is their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately reported by either side of the political spectrum. And checking this out can be really enlightening as it helps you kind of step outside of your own bubble and discover stories you might not see otherwise. I love this feature so much because it helps me get a sense of how people that don't think like me are looking at the same events. If you want to check it out for yourself, go to ground.news/wisecrack and give it a try. And if you use my link, you're going to get 40% off the Vantage plan, which gives you unlimited access to all of the features, which are going to help get you the information you need to navigate this increasingly weird time. Now, I think Ground News is doing really important work. I hope you check them out. But for now, let's get back to the show. When it came to the media, Powell warned conservatives to monitor television just as doggedly as they did textbooks, and encouraged special interest groups to complain to the FCC when free enterprise was treated unfairly. He urged corporate America to similarly propagate its ideas across written media, from popular magazines to scholarly journals. But back to Powell, who actually had one fourth pillar of his plan so chilling that we had to save it for last. He predicted that with an activist-minded Supreme Court, the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change. Corporations like Philip Morris started funding an explosion of legal foundations to sue the government for overreach against corporations' rights, including the National Chamber Litigation Center, which today has a 70% win rate in the Roberts Supreme Court. But as if to really prove his point, 3 months later, Powell eked out Nixon's nomination to the Supreme Court, where he would become the activist judge he had described in his memo, one with a fanatical belief in the interest of corporate America. Listen, I don't like him, but it's cool to have a dream and then achieve that dream That's cool. Powell's ascension to the Supreme Court set the stage for today's oligarchy by giving a voice to that forgotten man, the lowly corporation. Little corporation, you need help getting up the stairs? By 1978, he was penning a decision in the First National Bank of Boston v. Bellotti case that took the monumental step of declaring corporations' right to free speech. And by free speech, I mean the right to just spend a ton of money on ballot initiatives across the country. The legalese is complicated and boring, but the point is that Powell set a huge precedent in this corporate right to free speech, which laid the groundwork for Citizens United to flood corporate money into politics in 2010, facilitating the rise of corporate influence over political policy. 8 years after Powell galvanized his conservative tribe, the country elected the most business-friendly president it had seen in decades. My guy, Ronald Reagan. Now, the Powell-inspired Heritage Foundation sent Reagan a list of 2,000 policy recommendations, 2/3 of which it claims Reagan attempted or achieved. Today, many scholars draw a straight line from Powell's memo to the rise of corporate power in America that has consolidated wealth into the hands of the extraordinarily rich. If you're extraordinarily rich, give us money. Powell would be pleasantly surprised that the once supposedly politically reluctant businessmen have aggressively entered politics, creating a revolving door between corporate America and Washington, D.C. that skews everything in the favor of wealthy business elites. Like how George Bush's chief of counsel on environmental quality was an American Petroleum Institute lobbyist who personally edited climate reports to stoke uncertainty about the science. He later took a gig at ExxonMobil. Good for him. During Obama's time in office, the revolving door between tech and government thrived, with over 250 individuals moving between Google's empire and the federal government alone. Today, nearly 700 government officials, military officers, and members of Congress hold high-ranking positions at the top 20 defense companies, likely contributing to the intense price gouging on military contracts that constitutes half the Pentagon's budget. Since Powell's memo, the new oligarchy's influence over money and ideas has gutted welfare, crushed healthcare reform, and stymied action on climate change. Meanwhile, 741 billionaires, exemplified by the Musks and Zuckerbergs of the world, wield $5 trillion in wealth compared to the roughly $4 trillion owned by the bottom 50% of American households. This wielding of wealth is seen in Elon Musk's contributions to the Trump campaign, which then enabled his shadow presidency. So what made Powell's blueprint so effective in creating a system in which the business interest of an elite group matters way more than the interest of the general population? To answer that, it's worth returning to a few lines of the Powell Memo that may have made your ears perk up. Now, recall how Powell calls out the power of civil rights activists and radical minority activists. Now, this wasn't out of character. He once worried he wouldn't be confirmed to the Supreme Court because he'd publicly insulted Martin Luther King Jr. in numerous speeches, even dismissing King's letter from a Birmingham jail as simply a doctrine of anarchy that nobody intellectually honest could espouse. He also chastised black activists because at least they were better off in America than they would be in Uganda, and he warned another justice that full desegregation would make our cities jungles. I hope that hearing that felt a tenth as gross as it felt to say it. Now, as a justice, Powell wrote a majority decision claiming that the United States had become a nation of minorities and white people needed protection as a minority group. I think he might have been a bad guy. Powell's memo helped catalyze the kind of philanthropy that fully metastasized into the 1980s culture wars over things like humanities curriculums and political correctness, wars designed to trigger white animosity with the secondary aim of undermining working class solidarity. Now, this strategy is tried and true. It was used by the earliest oligarchs in America, colonial plantation owners who created a racial caste system to pit white European indentured servants against enslaved Africans. As historian Heather Cox Richardson notes, encouraging poor whites to identify with white landowners meant their lower-class white neighbors got the benefit of believing they were on the same level as rich men because they shared the same racial identity. They would not revolt because preserving the distinction between themselves and slaves was more important than seeking political power. Imagine that, you know? Imagine if the strong, rich, powerful white guys knew that the less powerful white guys would just do whatever they wanted because of racial animosity, and if they sort of fueled that racial animosity, Rachel, not Rachel, Rachel, we love you, that they could then just take power and do whatever they wanted with it. What if that happened? Gilded Age oligarchs and mass manufacturing created racial caste systems that made labor solidarity impossible, often using immigrants of color as strikebreakers, all while advocating for social Darwinism that treated white people as inherently superior. The political elite exploited sectional, racial, cultural, and religious cleavages to win office. Then they turned government over to the corporations. Or as magnate Jay Gould put it, I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. Jay Gould, also sounds like a bad guy. Despite America making some racial progress, this cleavage has been re-employed by the powerful conservative academic, media, and political machine to convince poor Americans that any government spending is bad because it amounts to handouts to marginalized groups. From Reagan's welfare queens.
She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare.
To today's war over DEI.
Are you saying this crash was somehow caused and the result of diversity hiring? And what evidence have you seen to support these claims?
It just could have been. We have a high standard. We've had a much higher standard than anybody else.
Which are parroted by Elon Musk and elevated on his social media platform. Oligarchs continue to foment racial grievances to distract people from their economic pain and encourage their business-friendly beliefs in small governments and even smaller taxes. When Powell envisioned a more politically empowered conservative business movement, he likely didn't picture a volatile near-trillionaire hacking into the Treasury Department. But the success of the agenda he laid out in his memo indisputably was a huge inflection point that helped get us here. Okay guys, that's all for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Please do subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.